Hello everyone, my name is Juliette Campassi. I'm the Events and Research Coordinator for the Institute of Leadership and Management. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce Kate Cooper, Head of Research Policy and Standards at the Institute of Leadership and Management. Kate, over to you.
Hello everybody, hello Juliette, and thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce Jo Riley, formerly Director of Leadership and Management Wales, now with us at the Institute, but before that Jo's got a lot of experience working in target-driven, high-performance environments. So who better than this afternoon to tell us about delivering outcomes? Thank you, Jo, and over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Juliette. And yeah, thank you. I am really delighted to have been asked to present this webinar because I guess for me it means that I now get to marry up my theoretical knowledge of the leadership theories around setting objectives and delivering those outcomes with my practical knowledge of actually delivering those objectives. So doing the doing, so to speak. So without further ado, let's crack on. So the Institute of Leadership and Management identifies 5 separate dimensions of great leadership, and you can see them here on your screens. They are vision, achievement, ownership, and collaboration with authenticity there at the heart. And within the dimensions, there are 49 components or building blocks, if you like, of what makes a great leader. And each of the 49 webinars focuses on one of the components of each dimension, highlighting essential learning to assist your leadership development. The third dimension, as we know, is achievement. Great leaders are high performers. They have direction, deliver measurable results, they're proud of their work, they stretch themselves and others, and they're adaptable to ensure sustainability. So the dimension of achievement consists of 10 components, which you can see on your screens now, covering topics such as managing performance and sustaining growth. And today, as you all know, we're focusing and exploring the leadership component of delivering outcomes. Because achieving leaders focus on outcomes. Now, don't tell Kate, but I think that focusing on achieving outcomes is one of the most important leadership capabilities. You can focus on building trust or being resilient, etc. But if you're not delivering your outcomes, then your organisation really isn't going to be too pleased with you. And of course, the real skill is in delivering outcomes while still being trustworthy and resilient. But I think it's also important to point out that the focus on achieving these outcomes shouldn't come at all costs. I think there's a real onus on organisations these days to ensure their corporate goals and objectives are ethical and sustainable. And this is something that we're going to focus on during this webinar when we look at how we set and measure our objectives. So for me, a focus on goals, objectives, outcomes, targets, KPIs, call them what you like, it's absolutely critical to achieving business success because, quite simply, if you don't know where you want to be, then you're unlikely to get there. And I liken this to a car journey. If you get in a car and start driving without knowing where you need to be, you're unlikely to get there. So you will end up somewhere and you may feel that you've been productive in doing that, but it's unlikely to be where you really needed to be. So I guess a good place to start is by understanding exactly what we mean when we talk about outcomes. So at a really basic level, all organisations exist to transform inputs into outputs which add value to the end user. So on your screen now, you can see there's quite a lot of detail around what inputs and outputs actually are. But I like to think of it as a sausage machine. So inputs are things that we put into the machine. And that's things like labour, so that's you and I, materials, information, capital equipment, land, buildings, etc. And in the case of our sausage machine, well, I guess it's the leftover bits from the pig, the bits that no one else wants. And then outputs are the things that spurt out from the machine. So they're the goods and services, or in the case of our sausage machine, they're the actual sausages. And quite often there's confusion when we talk about the difference between outputs and outcomes. So whilst the outputs are the actual goods or services, they're quite tangible things. You can normally see what the output is, even if it's a service. And for me, the absolute key in distinguishing an output is that it's measurable. It's easily quantified and evaluated. So back to our sausage machine, it's really easy to see and measure the number of sausages that we've produced. But outputs aren't necessarily the best measurement of success. So just because we've produced 100 sausages, so what? Doesn't mean to say that we've been successful. What's the point in producing sausages? What were we actually trying to achieve in the first place? And that's where we start to look at outcomes. So outcomes are always a bit harder to define and measure. They're just that bit more tangible and nebulous. You can't quite grab hold of them. And sometimes outcomes can even take years to materialize. But for me, the real key in defining an outcome is to describe a real benefit. So it's the changes, the benefits, the learning or other effects resulting from the output, i.e., what is it that we've achieved? So if we go back to our sausage machine, producing sausages isn't really the benefit, but the fact that we've turned the yucky bits of the pigs that nobody else wanted into something tasty and edible, that's a real benefit. We've added real value into the process now, and so that's an outcome. We've transformed something yucky that we couldn't sell, that nobody else wanted, into something tasty and edible. That's a real outcome, rather than the sausage that's just the output. So what we've just described is commonly known as the transformation process. And hopefully the schematic diagram that you've got on your screens at the moment, you can start to visualize the sausage machine process in this diagram. We've got inputs being transformed into outputs. And in order to achieve the best possible outcomes, we need to focus on maximizing the quality of that transformation process in the middle. We need to really maximize the value that we're adding to the process. And there's one additional feature of the transformation process that we haven't yet talked about, and that's the feature in the yellow box on the right-hand side, and that's the feedback loop. So as leaders, it's vitally important that we seek out as much feedback as we possibly can, because feedback provides us with really important information and new ideas and expertise about how we can improve our systems and processes, and so ultimately how we can become more effective in achieving our outcomes. And feedback can come from many different places. It can come from internal sources, such as employee feedback, testing and evaluation processes, and it can also come from external sources, such as customers, stakeholders, and suppliers. But the absolute key, really, as leaders, is to ensure that we seek out as much feedback as possible and that we listen to and act upon that feedback. So, at this point, you may well be wondering why all of this is important to you. And the reason for that is, as leaders, we should be focusing on outputs and not inputs, not micromanaging the inputs. So as leaders, we're often guilty of managing at the micro level. How many times do we focus on people's presence, team members' presence in a certain place, or the hours that they've actually worked, instead of really trusting our teams and allowing them the freedom and creativity to find the most effective ways, their own most effective ways of delivering their outputs. However, it's important to mention that if we are going to make this leap from, managing inputs to managing outputs, it can be quite scary at first, because of course you're relinquishing control. That can be scary. It's also really important to mention that it will only work if we set the right objectives and we set those objectives in the right way. So as team leaders, it's really important that we clarify what needs to be done and we create a vision and share goals. It's absolutely critical that our team's objectives align with our organisational objectives and that we are communicating that clearly to all team members so that they understand exactly how their output impacts on the organisational performance. It's also important that once we've established those objectives, we set in place key performance indicators or ways of measuring progress towards achieving our objectives. And we'll go on to talk about how we can best do that in the next section. So once we've done all that, it's the critical part. It gives us the freedom to allow our team to go off and be creative in finding the ways of achieving their own results. And it means that our job as leaders now becomes around removing obstacles from their path so that they're free to get on with delivering their targets. And of course, it's also important that we recruit the right people in the first place to do that. And just to reiterate, managing outputs rather than inputs isn't about directing or micromanaging. Now, I had an example of that happened to me personally this week. So Kate mentions I've moved across to the Institute, and I'm looking after delivering outcomes for Wales. It's very specific to that geographical area. And this week, one of my colleagues asked me to review a document that they had been working on. This document is really important. It's going to have massive impact on the Institute and, ultimately Wales, but in the longer term. And so, a bit tongue-in-cheek, I said to her, well, my outputs, I measured on delivering revenue growth just in Wales. So, the fact that I'm going to be looking at this document, will that actually help drive outputs in Wales? It's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek example, but it's just really important to highlight the fact that if we are going to focus on outputs, we have to focus on the right output. Otherwise, we run the risk of our team sort of running flat out in one direction, and not necessarily picking up the other direction. And in this particular instance, it was quite easily sort of rectified by popping a team objective in place, but hopefully it serves to highlight an example. So, following on from that example, if we are going to step back and give our teams the freedom to deliver their outputs, we need to specify the right outputs, as we've just discussed, but we also need to put in place an effective plan for measuring their progress at regular intervals. It probably sounds fairly obvious, but if we set an objective that needs to be delivered in 12 months' time, it makes sense that we check whether we're on course to achieve that objective regularly throughout those 12 months. And then if we start to veer off track, we can identify this straight away and put in place a plan to get us back on track really quickly, instead of having a massive shock at the end of the year where we discover that we're massively off target. So in order to measure the performance of objectives, what we normally do is establish benchmarks or measures against which we would measure performance and output. And these are known as KPIs, or key performance indicators. And I've also heard them referred to as SPIs, or strategic performance indicators. And really simply, KPIs are just a way of measuring progress against an objective. So if our objective is to improve customer service, then our KPI would be something along the lines of target the number of customer support requests that remain unsatisfied by the end of a week. So by monitoring this figure, we can directly measure how well we're doing towards meeting our longer term goal of providing that outstanding customer service. And on your screen at the moment, you can see some examples of different types of KPIs. So each department within an organisation is likely to choose different KPIs. You don't have to use all of the KPIs by any stretch of the imagination. It's just important that you choose KPIs that will help you measure the objectives that are specific to you. We've already touched on the fact that one of the biggest criticisms of KPIs is they tend to focus on short-term financial targets, or micro targets, if you like. Plus, again, as we've discussed, if these aren't the right objectives, then you might have a situation where every member of the team is working flat out and they're dropping other stuff, as we've already discussed. So this is where a tool such as the balanced scorecard, or the weighted scorecard, as it's sometimes called, can be useful. The balanced scorecard can help us measure and improve performance in a more integrated way, because first of all, it reflects the aspirations of all stakeholders. But secondly, it also measures both financial and non-financial measures. So the balanced scorecard was developed in the early 90s by Robert Kaplan. from Harvard Business School and David Norton, who is the founder of an IT consulting firm. And the balanced scorecard views organizations as 4 interdependent areas. So you've got the financial area, and these measure your traditional financial indicators such as sales, expenditure, income, etc. You've also got your customers and your stakeholders, and this area looks at your customers' view of your organization, includes things like customer feedback, customer satisfaction levels, etc. Then you've got your internal processes. So here you look at your main business processes like production, logistics or sales, and the focus here is on improving short-term efficiency. And then your final area is organizational capacity, and the focus here is on long-term learning and growth. So here you'd examine measures relating to employee development, retention and skills improvement, etc. So from each of those 4 areas, you would translate your vision into SMART objectives, into KPIs and into tangible activities to help you achieve your outputs. And the balanced scorecard, it's widely used. I mean, I think it's important to mention that some people aren't fans of the balanced scorecard because those measurements can be seen as subjective. They're not, those financial measures. But I think it's important that it's an alternative tool, and it really is quite widely adopted by organisations today. So no mention of performance measurements could be complete without talking about return on investment. So return on investment is the most common profitability ratio. It focuses on the money you invest in the business and the return you achieve on that money. And it's important because whilst of course it's great to achieve outcomes, it's also important that we do this profitably. If, for example, I achieved all of my objectives and in so doing generated £100,000 worth of revenue, but I actually spent £110,000 doing that, then that's probably not the best way that I could have spent the money. So the basic ROI formula, you can see it on your screens, is net profit divided by total investment times 100%. And so if I've got some examples here, you can tell I've used some simple figures because I'm no Carol Vorderman here. If I made a net profit of £50,000, but I had an initial investment of £25,000, then that would give an ROI of 100%. Basically, I would have doubled my money. And ROI is always expressed as a percentage, and the higher the percentage, the higher the ROI, the better. So a return of investment of 200% is better than 100% because it basically means that we've achieved a greater return for the same amount of the investment. And whilst ROI is an important business measure and it is relatively simple to understand, it's not always suitable for long-term investments. And that's because it's solely focused on those financial measures. And it can lead organisations to chase objectives which may provide good returns on their investment, but which might not be entirely ethical or environmentally sustainable. And this is where the triple bottom line can help. So as the name suggests, the triple bottom line continues to measure those profits, but it also measures the organisation's impact on people and also on the planet. And I think these days we have a far greater corporate conscience, and organisations are far more aware of their environmental impact and also their duty of care on their employees. So the triple bottom line enables organisations to consider the full cost of delivering their outcomes, and it also provides an opportunity to feed back into future outcomes. Mindfulness is an interesting concept when it comes to focusing on achieving outcomes. Before I explain how mindfulness can be related to achieving outcomes, I think it's important that we take a quick look at what we mean by mindfulness, because in my experience, we all have quite different views on what mindfulness means for us. So mindfulness was actually adopted from Buddhist meditation practices in the late 1970s, and it developed into a clinical approach for treating pain, anxiety, depression and stress. And I think it might be this background that makes some of us hesitant to adopt the practice of mindfulness within a business context. However, really, all mindfulness means is focusing our attention on the present in order to focus our mind and avoid distractions. So you can see on your screens, we've got this lovely definition of mindfulness, courtesy of Professor Kabat-Zinn, who I've actually seen referred to as the master of mindfulness. And he says, quite simply, mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. It's about knowing what is on your mind. And really specifically, mindfulness means being aware of what's going on inside your mind and body, but in a non-judgmental fashion. So just accepting what's going on rather than critiquing, or rather than being really harsh on ourselves, which I think we've all got a tendency to do. Mindfulness is also about being aware of your thoughts and emotions and actions right now. So what's happening now in the present, instead of focusing on the past or the future, instead of dwelling on that past or being anxious about the future. Mindfulness is also about being aware of what you are doing while you are doing it. So how many of us are guilty of multitasking and not really paying attention to any of the tasks that we're trying to do? How many of us are on autopilot? Or I heard a really interesting phrase the other day around sleepwalking through life. How many of us are actually giving 100% of ourselves to any task that we're currently undertaking? And finally, mindfulness also means being aware of what is going on in your outside world. So really observing your environment and paying attention to what is going on in the outside world right now. So as we've mentioned, it's really quite easy to not be mindful. And this can manifest itself in a number of different ways. People within organisations, we're increasingly busy. We're constantly bombarded with different tasks. And we find ourselves getting distracted by the past, replaying past events, perhaps wishing we'd done something a bit differently with the benefit of hindsight. As we've already discussed, being overly critical, perhaps setting unrealistic expectations of what we can achieve. And this obviously manifests itself in being anxious about the future, hoping that things will be different, getting overwhelmed by the present, feeling out of control. And ultimately, all of this just means that we're not fully present. How many of us have arrived at a meeting without being fully present, worrying about the outcomes of the previous meeting or thinking about the future meeting? So we can start to see ways in which mindfulness or really focusing on the task in hand can actually be beneficial in an organisational context. And I think there's a growing acceptance that wellbeing in the workplace is really important, and that actually it's an organisation's responsibility to ensure their employees are safe. And that doesn't just mean physically anymore, it's also starting to mean mentally. And mindfulness is really growing in popularity as a business tool. So since the late 1980s, we've seen some big name companies such as Google, Sony, IKEA, etc., adopting mindfulness training as a way of increasing personal and organisational productivity. So in order for us to be mindful in our jobs, we need to adopt a particular approach to our work. We need to focus our attention on what is actually happening. And this means focusing on the task in hand, being fully present. We need to be really curious about what we're doing, because that's how we're going to discover new things. We need to be really purposeful, efficient and disciplined. We need to step back, pause and reflect wisely. And we absolutely need to manage those mental conversations, that negative voice that creeps in, that self-doubt, as I like to call it. And I think, there will always be critics of mindfulness. And the purists will say that the definition we're using here today is watered down or diluted. But my argument would be, if we take the bits of mindfulness that are useful to us, so being present, focusing on the job we're actually doing and avoiding those distractions, then this has to be beneficial in helping us to achieve our outcomes. So, in summary, I hope we've demonstrated why it's important for you and your teams to focus on achieving outcomes. Hopefully, we've provided some context around why successful leaders focus on outputs rather than inputs. But in order to do this, I hope we've made sure it's important that we set the right objectives, and that we also need to have an effective measurement plan in place to ensure that we're keeping on track of those objectives. And finally, I hope we've provided some food for thought around how mindfulness can be utilised in an organisational context to help us focus our minds on the task in hand. For those of you that are interested, on your screen at the moment are a list of references that were used in preparing the material for today's webinar. But really, if you want any further information relating to today's component, I really would recommend that you head over to the Institute of Leadership and Management website, where you'll find our Leadership Essential leaflets on all of our 49 leadership components. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Kate. I think we've got time for a few questions.
Yes, we have. Thank you very much, Jo. We have a couple of questions. The first one is about, when do you revisit outcomes when circumstances change, your anticipated outcomes?
Well, that's a brilliant question, and I don't think there's any set answer to this. And Kate, you and I talk about this all the time. You know, it's related to sort of a performance review, isn't it? We should be doing it on an ongoing basis, rather than sort of, you know, setting a formal, you know, annual review of outcomes and, you know, 12 months later realizing they're the wrong ones. And I think, you know, hopefully I got that message across. It's absolutely critical that we ensure those outcomes, those KPIs, those objectives, you know, whatever you want to call them, are the right ones. So it's equally as critical to ensure that we're, you know, monitoring and ensuring that you know, they're sailing us off in the right direction on a regular basis.
Thank you. Yeah. And what about, you said earlier in the presentation, somebody's asking about when you deliver, you don't want to micromanage people, but at the same time you need to help them or define with them outcomes that are achievable and what you both want. How do you balance that micromanagement, or not wanting to micromanage, with the need to be specific, because that's sometimes helpful?
It's really difficult, and it's really scary the first time you do it. And let's also be really honest, you know, there are certain functions within an organization that lend itself more to managing outputs, you know, rather than input. So it's difficult to do that. You know, if you're in a retail organization, for example, and somebody, you know, literally needs to be on the shop floor, then, you know, it's a lot harder to focus on outputs. But, you know, my background is sales, and, you know, we talk about scores on the doors all the time. So yeah, it's really, really easy then. You've got to take the organizational objective, and I can't stress that enough. There's no point in setting team or individual objectives that are misaligned to the organizational objective. But so long as that vision comes down from the top, so that, you know, the organizational objective is clearly defined and your team objective clearly feeds into that, then I think it's relatively easy to do.
What about the going the extra mile that we hear so much about, that's in a measure of engagement and often included in people's performance appraisal interviews? Do you think that's a reasonable outcome, or how do you know it when you've got it?
Yeah, it's such a difficult one. I was literally chatting to Phil about this week, and you know, the same as some of the tools that we've spoken about today, you know, balanced scorecards, triple bottom line. The critics of those tools will say that they're subjective, and you know, with subjectivity comes, you know, disagreement and argument, etc. But I mean, if you're asking my personal opinion, then there has to be, you know, scores on the doors are great, and if you're hitting your targets, then there's no argument. You know, you're achieving your outcomes, there's no argument. But if you've got somebody that is, you know, putting in the effort, going the extra mile, as you said, and for whatever reason, you know, has maybe just slightly missed the outcome, then for me there has to be room for that, yeah, that discretionary, that subjective pat on the back, if you like.
And a final question, how do you set outcomes for people who aren't in sales sorts of roles?
Yeah, and it is harder. You know, it's much harder. I've been thinking about that a lot today, but it's around ensuring that you are really clear on what that organizational objective is. So what that organizational goal is, and that, you know, that can be anything. So, you know, a really sort of high level organizational goal might be, you know, for the Institute, we might want to be the best professional body in the world. So everyone would understand that as an objective, as a goal, but it's quite high level. How do we really get there? So then you need to just, it's a bit like how do you eat an elephant, in small chunks. Then you just need to break that down into manageable, achievable, this word SMART. We didn't talk about SMART objectives today, but that's what we're doing. We're taking those high level, those intangible, those nebulous objectives, and we're breaking them down into smaller, achievable and more measurable objectives. We talked about the customer service example. How do you measure whether you're getting better at customer service? Again, it is subjective, but you can put some real finite, tangible measurements in there, such as, reduction in number of customer service calls, reduction, I think we talked about during the webinar, reduction in the number of unanswered customer service queries. There are always ways of making those, those softer outcomes measurable.
Well, thanks, Jo. I'm afraid we've run out of time. In fact, we've slightly gone over. So back to Juliet for the final instructions. And thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening.